feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled TIFF review. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck. Alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Merchant.
It's time to talk about the one thing we've been waiting to talk about all TIFF.
Yep, it is day 2 of the 2024 Toronto International Film Festival. This is our first review we're recording, though.
Yes.
No TIFF talk this year. We kind of failed everyone.
We did.
We just didn't have time to do a preview of the festival. We didn't have time to really talk about anything beforehand. We've just been little busy boys this summer. But we did just do a Fan Expo episode, so you guys can go check that out. But we are back. We are covering TIFF this year. Once again, we will be here every single day with multiple reviews. We just got out of Mike Flanagan's The Life of Chuck.
And that actually ties in to Fan Expo because Mike Flanagan was at Fan Expo and also screened Oculus at TIFF as like a special screening.
Midnight Madness, like anniversary screening, which he did reference in the intro to this movie.
Yes, and boy did he take the time to kind of go into the making of this movie. And Mike Flanagan is no stranger to the world of Stephen King, and many of his original narratives as well, I think, owe quite a debt to King. And sometimes, some people are in the camp of like they like his adaptations of King more than his originals, and then some people like his originals that are riffs on Stephen King. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle where I really like. I think I like Mike Flanagan even more as a personality than I do necessarily a filmmaker, but he is very talented when it comes to creating this little world for himself that he brings back, actors that he's worked with multiple times. And he takes King adaptations that are kind of difficult to adapt.
Gerald's Game
is the perfect example of that, where, on paper that should not work as a film, and yet it does. And it's always, interesting to see what he's going to tackle as a director and then also as a writer in terms of adaptation, because it does feel like he is trying to find a way to make King's work accessible in a way where when you read King, King can go off on long tangents and it almost sounds like a voiceover narration, and we'll get into that a little bit with this, but even something like Dr. Sleep, which was somewhat polarizing because of the connection to The Shining and being a sequel, and obviously that adaptation by Kubrick is so revered, even though it's not really a one-to-one adaptation of King's book.
And King doesn't even really like it.
No, he doesn't.
Right?
He likes the Mick Garrison version of it more.
That's wild.
Yeah.
But Flanagan doing something a little bit different. I mean, still in his wheelhouse with a Stephen King adaptation, but a little bit more on the. I mean, it's not a horror movie at all. It does have a supernatural element. I don't think that's a spoiler or anything. It's a Stephen King novella that he's adapting, but a little bit more on the optimistic, schmaltzy side of things.
It leans more into a Shawshank, Green Mile, Stand By Me kind of feeling, where you have, as I mentioned, voiceover narration by Nick Offerman in the film, in the same way that the framing device for Stand By Me is with Richard Dreyfuss, kind of recalling a time in his youth, and it's very sentimental and melancholy in certain aspects, and then there are other parts of it where it's trying to champion living in the moment and enjoying both the good and bad, and trying to be present for those things, because you never know how much time you really have, and how that is the thing I think that most people might be afraid of in a way, because it's like, once you get closer to the end, or if the end abruptly happens, you do start to wonder, it's like, well, have I lived the life that I wanted to?
Yeah. I'll get right into it. I think I enjoyed the movie but didn't love it. I still think after seeing this I probably prefer my Flanagan in the horror realm. But I do really kind of appreciate that he kind of tried something different. Like, everything he's done has kind of felt like what you said, using the same actors, the same kind of tone, same kind of vibe. I think House of Usher was maybe his most ambitious thing recently that did kind of, yeah, to fall into that. I love the structure of this, told in 3 acts in reverse chronological order, which I think is a really interesting kind of narrative device. You said the Nick Offerman, narration. I kind of vibed with. It gave me like Twilight Zone energy at times.
Right. It felt like Stephen King to me, because the way that King writes, it almost sounds like an inner monologue in terms of how he describes characters, but then goes off on tangents and describes like minutia of someone's life in the most mundane detail of like what shoes they wore, or what they did a week before, or what meal they had, or just like these little things that maybe aren't really all that significant to the story, but maybe give you a little extra character to even a smaller supporting role.
Which I guess, I mean, when I say Twilight Zone, I guess I just mean the setup, and you get what I mean by that, right? Like
Rod Serling is also, like Stephen King, criticism aside for some of his short stories, novellas, and novels falling, pun intended, I guess, with this, falling short, King and Rod Serling, like those guys are great writers or pitchmen. Like they have really good concepts,
right?
And
just execution sometimes.
Yeah,
like,
or sometimes,
you always say the ending is always tough.
Well, that's always the criticism with King novels, to the point where they make fun of it in chapter 2, because when he's writing, and the way that he writes, it feels like he has a great idea, and there are bouts in many of his longer novels where he's with it, but then it almost feels like, oh, I've lost interest in this. Or I thought
I'm on to the next thing,
yeah,
right? Like he's a guy who pumps out so much stuff, right?
Yeah, and you just kind of feel like, oh, I kind of wish maybe he took a little more time on this, but he's become even more prolific in, I would say, the autumn to, now twilight years of his Twilight Zone years of his life,
Yeah. I really kind of vibe. I think the movie, I got less interested as it went on. I think the first act or the third act, I think it has an intriguing mystery throughout, but I think the more that mystery is revealed and kind of the more we go back to the beginning, I guess I found myself kind of less interested in it. I think Flanagan using all of his regulars, I think everyone's pretty good. I like Mark Hamill a lot. I like seeing people like Rahul Kohli pop up in small roles, who's been in a lot of his recent TV stuff. And
he has an ensemble.
That he likes using, and I think everyone's utilized well. I think it being marketed, sort of, even though they haven't really started marketing, but at least in the TIFF marketing, as a Hiddleston kind of vehicle, like it's not really in it that much.
It's interesting, without getting into spoilers. The first act feels like you're watching, it from the perspective of it being a spectator film.
Sure, yeah.
Right? And when you're watching the story unfold, it plays very much like The Stand.
Yeah.
The end of the world, the end of days, and how people would react in the situation in a modern setting.
Sure.
And how, the world is literally falling apart, and, what you hold dear, or your values, are tested in those moments.
And Chuck is on the periphery of it all.
Yeah, and you do feel as though, and we got this in the intro where Mike Flanagan was talking about, part of what inspired him to adapt this novella is the pandemic.
Yeah.
And you really do feel the pandemic, creating
Did King write it in 2020, like during it?
That's a good question, and we probably should know this, but
guys, we record these on the fly. We're running guns.
But it's him. That's the name of the novella, and Flanagan said that he read it in 2020.
Yeah.
And it, obviously at that point when we were in, March and April, there was so much uncertainty when it came to what we thought the world was going to look like, or if the world was going to be the same.
I think you see a lot of that in that third act, first act.
Yeah, and like there's going to be people out there that will attack the film based on it being woke or political in the sense of, it talking about climate change and
Sure.
globalization and all that kind of stuff.
But I think ultimately where it goes and how it sort of leans into that, but I feel like without spoiling anything.
Well, Matthew Lillard has a cameo in this,
Yeah.
and he references that, like, oh, even the extreme right wings
Yeah, sure, yeah.
kind of know that, like,
We were right.
well, science is right, and you can't you can't get around it. In the same way with math,
Yeah.
there's this huge thing about there's recurring lines and references to things that if you're paying attention throughout the film, or in that first chapter, which is chapter 3, they might come back in the same way where, like, King novels and King stories in general
Do that a lot
within the King universe, where characters and names are referenced, or locations or events from past ones. They all kind of intersect or cross together in a way that's kind of interesting. And I'm sure there is stuff in there that also intersects in terms of just, like, King's overall oeuvre.
Yeah,
but
totally.
For this in particular, it does feel like this weird microcosm of, like, what King does in general.
Yeah, and I think that, like I said, that narrative device of telling it in reverse chronological order, for those exact reasons that you're saying, the more you go back, the more is revealed of what the movie is about.
Maybe too much, and that might be a major criticism of the film, because Mike Flanagan to me is a lot like Joss Whedon, where
without being a horrible person.
Yes, not a bad man. Where he has a certain sort of style when it comes to his writing, specifically in monologues, that he'll tell you not only how the characters feel, but, like, what the sentiments are of what he feels in the moment, and it maybe over explains things to the point where there's no ambiguity, or there's this feeling of, like, okay, well, I didn't need to know all that, and the mystery's been kind of taken out of it, and everything feels
By the end of
crystal
it.
clear.
Yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah,
and I think
you don't need that.
I think that's why ultimately I'm, mixed positive. I think still mixed very positive. Like, I still really enjoyed my time in the movie. I think it's charming, schmaltzy at times, overly sentimental, sure, but I think, like, I feel like it's at this moment, I'm in my positive era, Eric.
Yeah.
I'm also the bad boy of cinema, but I'm also in my positive era, my optimistic era. So I'm here for that. Like, I kind of try to embrace that when I see it, especially in a movie that I think is earnest and, Flanagan, whose stuff is so dark at times that, like, and there is heart in his other stuff too, don't get me wrong. But I feel like him doing something like this at this time is welcoming to me, and I there are times during it that, like, maybe a dance sequence goes on a little too long, or, like, things like that, but even though it's a big part of the movie, so I understood the further we went back why that sequence went on so long. And
Coach Rohrbacher.
and there is a character named Rohrbacher, which I did enjoy quite a bit, and I even like some of the stylistic choices with aspect ratios and things like that. There's a great moment in that, it's not spoiling anything, in that dance sequence where, if you're, again, paying attention, why the aspect ratio changes, you see later when he's younger.
And who's the cinematographer?
Eben Bolter,
Yeah.
who is, he worked on The Last of Us, a really great dude, good cinematographer. Flanagan stuff always looks good. It's got that digital kind of, like, really clean look, but I like the look of his stuff.
There's something,
I mean? Like,
this looks, like, a little different compared to his, because the
other
other,
that orangey kind of,
I was going to say
warm
creamy.
lighting. Yeah, creamy is actually
where
a
it's
gross word, right?
but it has, like, this kind of soft, warm look, when he's making horror movies, or something that's, like, a little more darker in tone. But this kind of feels a little bit lighter compared to, like, it's almost like a creamsicle kind of thing, where this is, like, more of a popsicle.
I get that.
It's less milky, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Sure.
But it looks nice in terms of its digital aesthetic, but it does feel almost like you're watching something made for a streamer and not necessarily theatrical. And that's not a slight. a lot of his stuff looks like that.
Yeah.
But I do like the warm kind of glow that his stuff does.
We talked about like his auteur stuff of using the same actors, and I think his look, like I feel like he's one of those guys where I go, okay, he has a look and he commits to that, and even when he's doing horror and now doing something a little bit different, like it still looks like his stuff, and I'm sure he's worked with different cinematographers, but it always kind of has that.
And the Whedon thing as well, like the comparison, like it also comes with the dialogue. Like the dialogue has a very specific.
Yeah, it's almost like not how real people speak.
No,
like,
because it's all in terms of telling you.
It's stylized dialogue.
Yeah, it's stylized dialogue, but it's not pop culture-y in the way that Whedon was, but it does have like that TV kind of thing going on as well, where characters kind of spoon feed you, and sometimes it's not a bad thing, but there is a feeling like, okay, he's telling you how to feel in the scene. Yeah. He's telling you like what the themes are, what the topics are of the idea of living your life and enjoying it for what it is, and trying to savor the little moments, or the moments in which you don't want them to pass you by, and you want to be present in that period. And so like I appreciate that, but it's also just interesting thinking about how like Frank Darabont, when he was directing the Shawshank Redemption and Green Mile, less so with The Majestic, and then he switches over to horror with The Mist, and makes
The Mist rules, dude.
One of the great Stephen King, one of the greatest, most depressing endings ever.
God, yeah, it's great.
And then Flame
one of the
Again,
best. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
The black and white edition of that movie is one of the best.
I mean, in any format, that movie is amazing. Yeah. But then with Flanagan, like I think some of his strongest stuff is the movies that aren't necessarily based on King adaptations, but are inspired in some way, because even the way he plays with time in some of his TV shows, in terms of throwing you off, or like when things happen and when they circle back to reconnect to certain things, or connect in certain ways. I'm dancing around or trying to dance around certain aspects of this movie, but also some of his other work that if you haven't watched, he does play with time in an interesting way. I mean, even with Oculus, he did that. So like his themes and trademarks are all there. The way that he brings in cast members that he's worked with before, it always seems like he adopts new people as he goes along. And I don't know if someone like Mark Hamill per se is very good in this.
I liked him.
I like him in a sentimental
Pop.
kind of way. But Ziti, I think
Ziti,
it was. But in terms of like his performance, I felt it was a little bit arch. But then I loved seeing Mia Sara, who's probably best known to a lot of people for playing Ferris Bueller's girlfriend, and also she was in Ridley Scott's Legend and things like that. And but then you get like really great actors like Chiwetel Ejiofor, who can make a Carl Sagan voiceover, which could come off as a little cloying or like on the nose, sound natural, or as natural as it can be.
He's great. Yeah, I really do.
Oh, I mean, he's just one of those guys where like you can easily take him for granted as just like one like great actor. And like I love his interactions with people he meets along the way. And again, going back to The Stand or The Long Walk, which is another King novel that's finally being adapted, which also has Mark Hamill in it. So there's this interesting sort of continuity there, and then also like we'll be talking about The Last Showgirl at some point, even if it's in a wrap-up. I don't know if we'll do a full review, but it's interesting when you watch two movies back to back and they have the same music cue, with Dance Hall Days by Wang Chung in there, and like the references to movies, specifically musicals, CoverGirl, all that jazz, Cabaret, are apparent, and
made me miss Blockbuster.
Yeah, and it's it'll make you miss Pornhub too.
Rest in peace in that.
But the first act is very much like your classic setup of a King story,
which is I think why it was my favorite act.
And then when it gets to the second and third, it kind of deconstructs it, and then also plays with the meta nature of what you expect from a King story, but then kind of removing it a little bit and being more optimistic.
Yeah.
Because a lot of his stories tend to be somewhat
nihilist,
or existential in a way that is, based in tragedy, or mean-spirited in that fun kind of way where like a villain gets their comeuppance at the end of a story, where this feels a little bit more like...
I think it's smart or starting at the end and going back, because it starts in kind of a not so kind of a depressing. Like you said,
but it's also like there's something about it that's honest about how life does come to an end.
Totally,
and you're going to lose people, and not everything is great, but you need those moments in life as well, because if you don't have those moments, they don't make the good moments as as wonderful, because you need that balance.
And I think that's why the movie ultimately I enjoyed it, and I think because again in my optimist era, Eric. So this movie, this is a Matt pet peeve in this, and I know most people would be like, who fucking cares? But like what I hate in movies, which I think I've talked about it in the past, is that if you're a period piece but you go to a grocery store and you use modern products, I fucking hate it, and it does it here.
Are you talking about
the Coke can, for one?
Well, for a second there, I thought it was taking place in modern
That's
times.
what I thought, but I'm like, it's not. They would just listen to Blockbuster on an old or not listen. They rented movies from Blockbuster on an old TV, and then not only the Coke can, they go down an aisle of groceries, like a grocery aisle, and I noticed the bread was all modern packaging and shit like that. And I get it. You're probably...
That's my favorite band name, Modern Bread.
It's an independent... Well, Film Nation backed it and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting as well, because most of his productions, with the exception of like his earlier works like Oculus, have distribution.
With Netflix or...
Or Warner Brothers with Dr. Sleep. And so this... will get picked up. It obviously will.
It will, yeah.
It's just interesting that he kind of went the independent route for something like this and didn't go with the studio,
so usually
even though he has bigger names in it.
I would be a little bit more forgiving, being like, oh, it's an indie film. But I'm like, come on.
But it's an indie movie from a filmmaker that has the resources
that's what I mean.
To make
and
the
that's
continuity
a production
work.
design thing where it's just like, it's like a lazy, nitpicky thing that I have. Like, I'm like, if you're going to set your movie in that time period and you make everything else look that way, like, it's going to be noticeable to certain people. And I'm very in tune with, like, products and brand logos and shit like that. Yeah. So I immediately... There's something else we saw that actually did a good job that had a older... The Apprentice that we saw. Again, I think nails its aesthetic of even looking at Toronto... looking like New York in the 70s and 80s and stuff like that, and another small, like I guess The Apprentice is a smaller movie as well, but I don't know, that's a very nitpicky thing from me. It's not a huge deal, but it is something that...
But it's enough to take you out for a moment or to notice it in a way that maybe other people won't. But it did feel like when you saw that can of Coke, like I was thinking, like, wait, when does this take place?
Well, that's what I thought. Maybe Act 3 takes place like in the future kind of thing. So then I thought maybe as we went back in time, it was more in the modern day. Right. But then the Blockbuster thing and the TV that they're using.
Well, here's the other thing as well.
Unless they're old Blockbuster tapes, right? Like,
but that would be weird. Like what? Like why would you?
But
hold
then
on
the
to
dance
those?
And like all the school stuff.
Yeah.
Like it just.
But that's weird as well, right? Because you have you have this dance sequence, with Coach Rohrbacher, but which is very funny. And there's a move that's done that's a very well-known dance move.
Yeah, sure.
And all the kids seem to not know what it is. Yeah. And so that's kind of
I think it was more like they didn't know how to do it.
I don't know. The way they reacted to it was like, what is this?
Yeah. Oh, you're inventing this.
Yeah. How do you do this?
I kind of agree with that too. So anyways, those are kind of some nitpicky things. I think overall it mostly works. I don't think I was ever in love with it. I think I still prefer Flanagan doing horror than sentimental kind of schmaltzy stuff, but
he hasn't done a lot of it. I shouldn't say that.
The one
he does do a lot of that in
that's true.
his horror
stuff,
right?
Which I don't like the end of Bly Manor. I hated that last episode because it is very schmaltzy
Yeah.
and feels like. Did you see Bly Manor?
No, I didn't. But like Haunting of Hill
Hill
House
House even has some
has
of
a
that.
lot of
That's
that.
actually a great
and
point.
with-
I just think of the horror elements, and
But I think the
of those.
payoffs are better
Yeah.
in that, and
I
especially with
agree.
long form when you spend more time with
with
the
the characters.
characters.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
when something devastating happens to one of them, you feel it a little bit more, and you understand, like, you have like this emotional connection because you've had more time. And I think what this story does is it makes it less in some ways, but then there is an aspect of you're watching this, and I was thinking of, there's always been this conversation, and I can't remember the name of the kid, but
Jacob Trump.
no, Jacob Tremblay. Well, there is a funny, there's a sequence in chapter 2 that involves a busker who's playing the drums, and she has a hat, and that reminded me of Rose the Hat from Dr. Sleep. But
I thought of the same thing.
But going back to...
Have you watched the director's cut?
No,
of
I
Dr.
haven't,
Sleep?
and
It's
I
great.
do want to watch it.
It's really good.
Yeah,
I watched
and I
it.
really like Dr. Sleep. So, but going
We
back...
sorry to cut you off one more time.
How dare you.
We recorded our Dr. Sleep review, much like we're doing right now.
Yeah.
I remember being in a Tim Hortons with you, remember?
Yeah.
And we did that. Anyways, we're sitting in a food court, everyone.
There's this theory, and I should have looked it up beforehand, but we're recording, we're doing this in the moment on the fly.
Yeah.
And I do know the name of it because I've looked it up 100 times because I was obsessed with it as a kid, and especially when I was watching a lot of TV, where I think it's Saint Elsewhere. At the end of the series,
Is it the kid with the snow globe?
yeah, and so like
Spoilers.
all these other shows cross over with it because they had characters from other shows. So like Law and Order and Hill Street Blues and stuff like that. Like Munch is a character, like The Wire, things like that, and they all take place within this autistic child's mind. And that was like this running theory for decades after it happened. So it's like, even like Homicide: Life on the Street takes place in this like
Kid's
child's mind, which I always found fascinating.
We are not going to give any scores. That's actually a new thing that we're, I guess, talking about right now. So Eric and I, after talking, have just realized we're just going to kind of let our reviews do the talking and not kind of put scores on things. Moving forward, we just want to have good conversations. But I think definitely worth a watch, I think, to get your own opinion on the movie. I think when it ultimately drop, I think a streamer will pick it up.
Yeah.
I have a feeling.
If you're a King completist, you're going to watch this no matter what, and that's always interesting as well. Like, where does this fit within, the multiple adaptations? Sometimes, taking one novel and adapting it over and over again, and seeing where it fits. I don't know, like it's nowhere near Shawshank.
Or Green Mile.
Like Green Mile, like it's not great, but I think it has.
I like
moments.
both of them, but
I do too. I think it's better than The Majestic.
Okay,
which I don't know if that's saying a whole lot,
yeah.
but it's been a while since I saw The Majestic, and I remember being really excited about that because it was Jim Carrey and a Frank Darabont adaptation.
Okay.
But in terms of like looking at King's work, like, there are so many films and TV shows that are complete failures, but maybe are more interesting because of how weird they are, or how they try to adapt something that's kind of harder to adapt because maybe it's connected to the Dark Tower series. That's why like something like Insomnia hasn't been adapted, because it's connected to that, and there's so many references to the Crimson King and things like that. We should also mention though that the end, it was nice to see that it was dedicated to Scott Wampler.
I was gonna say that exact thing. Scott, who was the
King
film
cast.
critic, and he also was a host, one of the hosts of the King's Cast.
And many people who are in this film,
diehard Stephen King fan,
or
too,
people that are in this movie and have worked on this film. Mike Flanagan has been on that show. David Desmalchin. So there's a lot of people that that have worked in that as well. So that was really
lovely to see. I obviously neither of us really knew Scott. I knew him from Twitter. One of the all-time greats on Twitter, really.
I listened to I didn't listen to a lot of episodes just because time is precious, and it's not a slight to the Kingcast. It's just that
You can only listen to so
you can only
many
listen
things.
to so much, but I did listen to one of David Desmalchin's episodes because he talked about Graveyard Shift, which is about a rat in a cotton mill.
Okay.
And then also Jay Cheel was on an episode where he was talking about Needful Things.
Okay,
and,
cool.
They were really lovely episodes, and Scott knew Stephen King, from back to front. Like
Yeah.
he true, and like that's the thing about Stephen King that I'll always love about him, and I think I've mentioned this before, is that like he got me into reading,
Same,
like,
actually,
and
like,
he was one
I-
of those guys where it's like, you see the flaws in it, but he was always an exciting writer, and
He's
has a very wicked sense of humor.
He's definitely probably one of the most iconic writers of all time. So, well, thank you all for listening. We really do appreciate it. We'll be doing tons and tons of reviews throughout the festival, whether they're in a food court or outside somewhere. They'll all kind of sound like this, maybe not as echoey, but our first few are like this. Please go check out our other reviews. We have a review up for The Brutalist, which you guys can check out. The Apprentice should be up soon. We're seeing We Live in Time.
The horse movie.
The horse carriage, not carriage, carousel movie.
The merry-go-round.
We also did some pre-screenings for things like Anora and Conclave, so you'll get those all over the next probably few days. We'll try to do 2-3 reviews out each day for you guys. But thank you. Please go check out our letterbox, which is Untitled_movies. You can follow both Eric and I on all those social medias at Matt Rohrbeck and at EM6211. We are posting our immediate reactions to most of the movies that we're seeing. So if you want to get those right away before you listen to these conversations, you can do that over there. But yeah, I love TIFF, clearly, as it's a Friday night at 9:30 where we're sitting in the Path in Toronto recording reviews, and I'm excited to do more. This was a fun conversation, so thank you all again. We really do appreciate it. It's my favorite time of year to do this show. I know it kind of gives it a different flavor as well when we record it on a phone on the fly.
It's
So
raw and real,
always
man.
Raw and
Raw and
real,
real.
just like us. The bad boys of cinema. All right. Anything you want to plug? I already plugged your social.
Yeah, no, you're good.
You're
You're
good.
golden.
Okay, until next time.
Thanks, Chuck.